The German pilot peered through the plexiglass of his cockpit. Below him, the English countryside rolled by in a blur of green and gray. He was flying over Dover. The engine of his Junker hummed a steady rhythm, but his heart hammered against his ribs. He had been sent to find the invasion force, and he found it. Through the gaps in the clouds, he saw them. Hundreds of Sherman tanks lined up in the fields, artillery batteries positioned near the cliffs, trucks moving in convoys along the muddy roads. It was the 1st United States Army Group, General George Patton's army, the force that would crush the Third Reich. The pilot keyed his radio, his voice cracking with adrenaline. He reported the coordinates. He confirmed the buildup. He turned his plane back toward occupied France, convinced he had just seen the end of the war. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden history of World War II, please take a moment to subscribe. The pilot was right about one thing. He had seen the army that would decide the fate of Europe. But he was wrong about everything else. If he had dropped a single bomb on that field, he wouldn't have heard the screech of tearing metal. He would have heard a pop, because the tanks were made of rubber, the artillery was made of plywood, and the entire army was a lie. It was May 1944, southeast England. The world was holding its breath. Across the Channel, the Nazis had built the Atlantic Wall. Hitler knew the Allies were coming. He just didn't know where. The logic pointed to the Pas-de-Calais. It was the shortest route across the English Channel. It was the direct path to Germany. And the Allies needed Hitler to believe that logic. They needed him to believe it so much that he would keep his best Panzer divisions waiting in Calais, far away from the real landing beaches of Normandy. Enter the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. They were not typical soldiers. They were artists, designers from New York and Philadelphia, sound engineers, architects. Their mission was not to fight, it was to perform. Private Arthur Miller stood in ankle-deep mud. The rain in Dover was relentless. It soaked through his wool uniform and dripped off the rim of his helmet. His hands were raw from wrestling with cold, wet canvas. He wasn't holding a rifle. He was holding an air hose. "Easy on the valve," a voice whispered next to him. Arthur looked at the M4 Sherman tank in front of him. It looked formidable. The barrel was menacing. The treads were caked in mud. But as the wind gusted, the 30-ton war machine swayed like a balloon at a county fair. "If this thing blows away," Arthur muttered, "General Patton is going to kill us himself." The air stank of wet rubber and ozone. Generators hummed in the distance, powering the compressors. All around them, men were lifting tanks with their bare hands. 4 men to a tank. They positioned them in precise rows. They covered them with camouflage netting, but not too perfectly. They wanted the Germans to see them, just not too clearly. "Hey, Artie," the sergeant hissed. Arthur looked up. "Yeah?" "Move it! Recon plane!" Arthur's stomach dropped. This was the game. If the plane flew too low, the pilot would see the seams in the rubber. He would see that the cannons were drooping. He would see that the massive army didn't have any heat signatures. But if they hid everything, the deception wouldn't work. They had to be visible, but elusive, like a ghost. Arthur grabbed the corner of the rubber tank. "Lift on 3, he whispered. 1, 2, 3. They heaved the massive machine onto a new patch of grass. They had to make it look like the army was active, like it was preparing to board ships. From the sky, it had to look like coiled energy. On the ground, it felt like a farce. In his diary that night, Arthur wrote a few lines by the light of a dim lantern. "I feel like a set dresser on a Broadway show. The audience is lethal. If they realize the props are fake, the curtain comes down on all of us." But the visual trick was only half the lie. The Allies knew that rubber tanks weren't enough. They needed sound. They needed to create the sonic footprint of a 150,000-man army. Arthur watched as the sound trucks rolled into position. They were massive half-tracks mounted with enormous speakers. The technology was cutting edge. Wire recorders, high-fidelity amplifiers. They had recorded the sounds of armored columns at Fort Knox, the screech of treads, the roar of engines, the shouts of sergeants, the bridge-building crews swearing at the mud. Arthur stood by the speaker truck as the engineer adjusted the dials. The silence of the English countryside was shattered. A cacophony of heavy armor erupted from the speakers. It was deafening. The sound carried for 15 miles. Across the channel, German listening posts picked up the vibrations. They heard an army revving its engines. They heard the threat. "Turn it down!" Arthur yelled over the noise. "No!" the engineer yelled back. "Why?" "They need to hear it in Berlin." But then the situation twisted. Intelligence came down from the top. Double Agent Garbo, working from London, had been feeding lies to the Nazis for months. He told them the FUSAG army in Dover was the main force. He told them Normandy was just a diversion. But now the weather turned. A storm battered the coast. The real invasion was paused. The fake army had to work harder. They had to simulate impatience. Arthur and his squad spent the entire night in the mud. They weren't just inflating tanks anymore. They were making tracks. They took bulldozers and carved deep ruts into the fields behind the rubber tanks. They drove trucks in loops to create convoys that went nowhere. They created a traffic jam of nothingness. Then the order came. June 6th. D-Day. The real ships were hitting the beaches in Normandy. Men were dying in the surf at Omaha and Utah. The sky over France was black with flak. Arthur stood in the field in Dover, listening to the radio reports. He felt sick. He was safe in England, playing with balloons, while his friends were charging into machine gun fire. But his job was about to get harder. The commander gathered them. "Listen up," he barked. "The Germans are confused. They think Normandy is a trap. They think the real hammer is about to fall here, from Dover. We have to keep them thinking that. If Hitler moved the Panzer divisions from Pas-de-Calais to Normandy, the invasion would fail. The Allies would be pushed back into the sea. Arthur had to keep the Panzers pinned down. He had to make the Ghost Army scream. The next 48 hours were a blur of exhaustion. Arthur ran from position to position. They deflated tanks and moved them 2 miles down the road. They re-inflated them. They lit fires to simulate camp kitchens. They drove empty trucks in endless circles until the fuel ran dry. They created fake radio traffic. Operators tapped out millions of messages. Orders for fuel. Orders for maps of Calais. Orders for winter gear. It was a masterpiece of fiction. Arthur grabbed a shovel. He was exhausted. His hands were blistered. "Keep digging," the sergeant said. "Why?" Arthur gasped. "Latrines." "For who? There's nobody here." "The Germans can count latrines from the air, Arthur. Dig." So he dug. He dug holes for men who didn't exist. He laid wire for phones that wouldn't ring. He became a stagehand for the greatest deception in human history. Across the channel, the German high command was paralyzed. Rommel wanted to move the tanks to Normandy. He saw the invasion happening, but Hitler refused. Hitler looked at the reports from the spy Garbo. He looked at the aerial reconnaissance photos of the tanks in Dover. He listened to the radio intercepts of the massive army waiting in England. He was convinced. "Normandy is the feint," Hitler declared. "We wait for Patton." So the panzers sat idle. They sat in Calais, waiting for an army of rubber and air. Arthur didn't know this at the time. He only knew the rain and the mud. He slumped against the wheel of a fake artillery cannon. He pulled his diary from his pocket. The paper was damp. He wrote, "We are screaming at the empty sky. I hope someone is listening. I hope it matters." It mattered more than anything. For 7 weeks after D-Day, the German 15th Army stayed in Pas-de-Calais. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. Top-tier tank divisions. They waited for the Ghost Army. By the time they realized they had been fooled, it was too late. The Allies had broken out of Normandy. They were racing toward Paris. Arthur and the men of the 23rd Special Troops had held back more German divisions than any real army group could have. They did it without firing a shot. They did it with imagination. According to declassified records, the operation was so secret that the soldiers couldn't tell their wives for 40 years. The Ghost Army saved an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 American lives. Every rubber tank that drew a German eye was a real tank that didn't fire on the beaches. Arthur survived the war. He went back to being an artist. He painted landscapes and portraits. But he never forgot the masterpiece he helped create in the mud of Dover. If you want more forgotten stories of real people who lived through WWII, subscribe. This channel exists to bring their voices back. War is usually decided by who has the most firepower, but sometimes it's decided by who tells the best lie. And the Ghost Army told a lie that saved the world.